8:46 a.m. Mohammed Atta and the other hijackers aboard American Airlines Flight 11 crashed the plane into floors 93 through 99 of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 9:03 a.m. hijackers crashed United Airlines Flight 175 into floors 75 through 85 of the World Trade Center's South Tower. 9:37 a.m. hijackers aboard Flight 77 crashed the plane into the western facade of the Pentagon in D.C. 9:59 a.m. the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. 10:28 a.m. World Trade Center's North Tower collapses 102 minutes after being struck by Flight 11. This is Tuesday, September 11, 2001. Roughly 3,000 people lost their lives that day. Last week we talked about creation and we looked at Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and we looked about God in Genesis 1. He ends Genesis chapter 1 verse 31 with, "And it was very good," and that was the end of day 6. And then we looked at our messing up of perfection and what God intended we messed up. You might be wondering why I started with some of the events of 9/11, and the reason I did that is because it's viewed as one of the worst days in American history, because it's the greatest terroristic attack on the United States to date. It's something that every year we have a memorial, we go and we think about this on 9/11, and it's one of those things, you say 9/11, you know what it is. But the thing about it is it's not the saddest day in history. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 6, because this account that we read in Genesis chapter 6, 7, 8, and 9, starting in verse 5 says, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I ever made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." What had to have changed between Genesis 1:31, where God says it was very good, to now he's sorry he ever made it? What had to change in 5 chapters, from chapter 1 to chapter 6, what had to change in that time period that God says, I'm sorry I ever made them? In verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, and break rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. So there's so much violence, there's so much evil in the world that God can't be in the presence of it anymore. So he decides to restart. And he takes Noah, who in verse 8 we read found favor in the eyes of the Lord, and his 3 sons and their wives. So there's 8 people, and he tells Noah to build this ark. We don't know exactly how long it took Noah to build this ark, but we know a rough estimate of probably 45 to 75 years it took him to build this ark. And during this time, Noah's preaching to his neighbors. He's telling people, because they're probably asking questions, when you start building a 300 cubit ark, I would assume your buddies are asking what you doing, Noah, because they've never seen rain before. They've never seen that much water. And all of a sudden, he's telling them, you have a chance. They choose not to listen. They make fun of him. And by the end, when God finally sends the flood, there's still only 8 that are faithful. In verse 17 of chapter 6, it reads, "For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth, to destroy all flesh, in which of the breath of life under heaven, everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you and your sons and your wives, and your sons' wives with you." So turn with me to chapter 7, verse 4. "For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came upon the earth, and Noah and his sons and his wives and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood." What we know about this is that Noah builds the ark to the dimensions the Lord asks him to, but he gets 2 of every kind. And what we know as a rough estimate is there were probably 1,400 kinds on the ark. There were probably about 6,450 animals that made this ark. And you might be asking, how on a 3-tier ark are you fitting that many animals? They're baby animals, because the problem is that they use full-grown adults that can't reproduce when they get off the ark. Noah's 600 years old. What we know about Noah is when he has his youngest son, he's 500. So a lot of people take verse 3 of Genesis chapter 6. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he and his flesh, his days shall be 120 years. A lot of people take that to say that Noah took 120 years to build the ark. But that's not possible, because his youngest son wasn't born. Therefore, when God tells him to build the ark, it doesn't make sense. So it's within 100 years. On that 600th year, Noah goes in the ark. And what we see is for 40 days and 40 nights, it's going to flood. But I want us to look at verse 16, because this is my favorite verse in the whole story of chapter 7. And those that entered, male and female, of all flesh, went in as God has commanded him. And the Lord shut him in. The reason I love this verse so much is because of what it signifies. It's not Noah, it's not his wife, it's not his sons, it's not his sons' wives who shut them in. It's God. God throughout all of this is the one who protects them. The one who gives the final okay is God. By shutting the door, it's saying this is okay and we can start this terrible, terrible flood that's going to happen. In verse 21, and all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, livestock, beasts, all swarming creatures that swim on the earth, and all mankind, everything on the dry land in whose nostrils had the breath of life died. He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those who were with him in the ark, and the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. I can only imagine that those people who at the beginning make fun of Noah are now banging on the ark that they can get saved. And it's too late. God shut the door. Noah can't open the door. God has shut it so that he's the one who will open it. And the problem here is I can imagine people screaming as they're starting to drown, and they realize that Noah wasn't lying. That God's plan, because this time that Noah's building the ark, he has to have faith that God's going to prevail. Because this whole time, there's no water. There's no flood. What is this man talking about? And all of a sudden, God says, it's time, Noah, get in the ark. Get in there with the animals. And now, every single thing is a dead carcass that's outside the boat. Besides those animals and besides those 8 people, everything's dead. And then chapter 8, verse 6. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent forth a raven. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. So the raven doesn't even come back. It just keeps going back and forth until the waters are dried up. Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he brought out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. So he waits another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf. What we know about olive leaves is that it was a peace symbol. And so by this dove being able to bring back this peace symbol, it's the first time that they're able to see the tops of the trees. This doesn't mean the water's gone. This just means they can see the tops of the trees for the first time. So Noah knew that the water had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth a dove, and she did not return to him anymore, meaning that there was enough water dried up that they could place its feet on a tree. And then in verse 13, in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. In the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Then God said to Noah, go out from the ark, you and your wives and your sons wives with you. And so they've been on the ark for over a year now. And finally God says you can go out. And they offer God a sacrifice with a pleasing aroma. And I can imagine getting off this ark, everything you've ever known changes. Because as they're walking off this ark, all of a sudden, their neighbors, their friends, their family, everybody's just laying out there dead. All the animals. The smell that must have been after they got off that ark. Because everything they ever know, except for what's with them on the ark. And so, chapter 9, verse 1. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the flesh of the sea. Into the hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man, from his fellow man I will require reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, but by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. And for the first time since we had him saying, I'm sorry I ever made it, God realizes again why he made man, because it was in his image. And what he's saying here is that they can eat of anything that's around them, but if it has blood in it, leave it alone. And if you kill somebody, God says that you're going to have bloodshed too. And so verse 7, and you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. And then God said to Noah and said to his sons with him, Behold, I establish my covenant with you, that your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds and livestock, and every beast of the earth with you. As many as came out of the ark, it is for every beast of the earth. And so he's going to establish a covenant here. And what I want us to look at is that it says that it's going to be for us too, for those in the future, you and your offspring. We are included in that. And so we see in verse 11, the covenant that he establishes is, I will establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And so God realizes what he's done, and he knows the whole time what he's done. But for the first time, he says he's remorseful with what he did. And he says, I'm never going to flood the earth entirely again. Now you might be saying, but we still see floods today. This is talking about the whole world being in a flood. It doesn't mean we won't have natural disasters. It doesn't mean we won't have flooding. It doesn't mean that we won't have heavy rains and thunderstorms. But what it's saying is that for the first time, there won't be a global flood again. There won't be so much rain and destruction that all flesh will die by water. And so here, I want us to look at verse 12. And God said, This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. That's us, included in that. And I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you, and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it. And remember that everlasting covenant between God and every living creature to all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. And so God puts his rainbow in the sky. And it's something we still see today. When it's raining and we see a rainbow, it's God's remembrance that he's not going to flood the earth again. It's something we can continue to see until Jesus comes again. We're going to be able to continue to see this covenant that God sets up with Noah and his family. And in this story, we sometimes put Noah on this pedestal because Noah is a man of great faith. If we look at Hebrews chapter 11, which is an account that we often refer to as the Hall of Faith. In verse 1 it says, Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So we have a definition of how you make it into this chapter. And then verse 7. By faith, Noah being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. Concerning events unseen, he constructed an ark. Noah doesn't know that the flood's going to happen for sure. He trusts God enough to listen to him to build this ark. And not just build it, but build it to the perfection that God calls him to. Noah could have said, it's easier if I do this or that. But that's not what it's about. He does exactly what God calls him to do. And for some reason, we've treated this like a VBS story. And we tell our kids, and we have this excited story of Noah and the ark because there's a lot of animals. And who doesn't love animals? I mean, animals are really cool. You go to a zoo, you get to see all these awesome things God's created. And when my dad worked for the Creation Museum, we went to the Ark encounter and we got to see their petting zoo. And we got to play with a lot of cool animals that I probably should not be allowed to touch. But animals are something we all can relate to. It's something that we all look up to. That's fun and it's awesome. And I think we've all seen the picture with the half oval boat with Noah and his buddy the giraffe on the top, and he's sticking his head out the window and he's got his little tongue out and he's all excited. That's not what this story is, though. We've turned this story into a children's story that isn't true. We've undermined God and we've undermined his power in the flood. By doing that, we've said, oh, this is something kids just need to learn. This is something that we've taught, we've kind of understood, but it's not for us anymore. It's for our kids. The problem with that thought process is that it quickly doesn't be remembered. We quickly forget what God did and why he did it. The world was so evil and so violent and so messed up that he's sorry he ever made it. And then at the end, he's sorry he destroyed it and he's remorseful. But he's not sorry in the way we think of it. While it sounds like by me saying he's sorry he did it, that he regrets doing it, it's not like that. The thing with this idea of him being sorry he ever made man, he's sorry he can't be in the presence of man anymore. That's what the heart of this issue is that he's sorry that man's so wicked and evil that he can't be in his creation's presence anymore. We talked about in the garden where when they get kicked out, there's separation between God. And so we have this Noah who's this great faithful guy. But turn with me to Genesis chapter 9. Because I want us to look at this part that we often leave out when we're talking about Noah and the ark. Starting in verse 20. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. And so what we have here is, we have after the flood, I can imagine where Noah's coming from, because it has to be depressing getting off the ark. Because everything you know, everybody you loved, everything you loved is gone. But it's not gone from your memory because it's right in front of you. And you can't really leave it. So it says he becomes a man of the field and he gets drunk. And he lays uncovered and his son finds him and his sons cover him up. And we won't read all of it because we don't have time. But his sons cover him up and then Noah curses him because of what they did to him. But the problem is, Noah in this has so much faith and yet still messes up. Noah has so much faith. Noah does exactly as God commands, but he still messes up. What that does for me is it gives me peace. Because it tells me that no matter how much faith I have, no matter how much I try, when I mess up, it's not good, but it's going to happen. It's not good that I messed up, but it's going to happen. We are humans. We are imperfect. We have, through generations, for some reason, treated Bible characters as if they're perfect, not just Jesus. And we've said, I've got to strive to be like them. We have to be exactly like them, but we forget about their mess-ups. We forget about David and the mess-ups he had with Bathsheba. We forget about Paul and how he killed Christians before. We forget about all the bad because it's easier to think about the good and say, we can't achieve that, so we're not going to try. So you might be asking, why does this matter to me today? Why is something from the Old Testament so relevant to me today? 1 Peter talks about this idea, and it's one of my favorite conclusions because the story doesn't end in Genesis. It doesn't even end in Hebrews where it talks about his faith and condemning the world. But it ends in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 20. Because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who had gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. And so Peter connects the Old and the New Testament here and says this. Just as those 8 people on the ark were saved, and God shut them in, and they were saved through water in that ark, so does baptism now save us today. The same idea of being immersed in water and being protected to rise back up and come back out. It's the same ideology here, and he's making the illustration that just like the ark was able to save these 8 people, today we have greater salvation through Christ, who's at the right hand of God. When we think about events like 9/11, and we think about destructions like what happened in Texas, and we think about different things that happen in our world and the corrupt nature of our world, it's sad. And it breaks my heart that there's still evil in this world, but what we know is there's going to be evil until Jesus comes again. And while I read what happened, some of the events of 9/11, I didn't read them all for a reason. I don't want us to focus on that because 3,000 people lost their lives, and we should remember that, and that's something we need to continually think about and continually mourn the loss of 3,000 lives. But here's the thing. What happened in these 40 days is so much greater. The whole world, but minus 8 people, because of their actions, because of nothing more than their evil and their wickedness. We have an opportunity today to separate ourselves from that evil and witnesses. We have an opportunity to put on Christ in baptism. We have the opportunity to set ourselves apart, to be called to be different. We are not supposed to be of the world, but we're supposed to be transformed from the world. We're called to be different. Today in Bible class, we talked about the fiery furnace. And one of my favorite parts of the fiery furnace is this. That no matter what they do, they don't bow down. And when the king gives them a second chance, when King Nebuchadnezzar gives them a second chance to finally bow down, they say, "Oh, king, we don't need you. We have a God that's going to protect us." And they're okay going in the fire because they have enough faith in God that he's going to save them. They're stand-up people in a bow-down world. When everybody else, when culture says this is how you're supposed to act, when culture says this, when my friends say this, when my family says this, when everybody else is doing something else, I'm supposed to be different. I'm supposed to be set apart. It's hard. I can't imagine it was easy on Noah while he's building this ark to not do what everybody else gets to do because it's so easy, because it's all around him. We don't have that today. We don't have only 8 faithful people because there's more of us in here than 8. But it's not always easy. It's not always easy to succumb to sin. It's not always easy to separate ourselves. But if there's anything we can do for you today, whether that's putting the Lord on in baptism or need prayers, whatever we can do, please come forward us together with saints.